This lecture is on creating a federal budget, the relationship between Congress, the president, and the idea of fiscal policy, which is fiscal policy is budgets, federal budgets. Monetary policy, we'll talk about later, is about currency and how currency is manipulated. But fiscal policy is about budgets, and that's what this is about. So, what is a budget? Just very simply, it's a moral document, meaning that it speaks to the priorities and goals of policymakers. So, if you just do a simple little exercise where you look at what you spend money on, then you can sort of determine what is important to you. That is why I'm saying it's a moral document. You look at budgets and you determine where value is, because that's where the money follows value. And so when we think about what the budget is at a federal level, we're looking at how much do we value the military over education? How much do we value healthcare over science and technology spending? And you can look at a budget and sort of make those determinations. Budgets bring in revenue, so that's the tax dollars that we're looking specifically at the tax dollars and how those are brought in. That's revenue dollars brought in. Expenditures are dollars spent. So that's what an expenditure is something you spend money on. So here are some of the sources of revenue that we have in our system. We have the individual income tax. So you're talking about April 15th. It is a progressive tax system, meaning that the tax rates go up from the lowest bracket to the highest bracket, the rate will raise. And we'll look at some graphs in a minute that will further that. The 16th Amendment talks about income tax and the taxing of people's income. This is very important you understand it is taxing income. So the richest people in America don't have incomes, right? And so they are taxed at a different rate. They have a different tax system, and it's much lower than the progressive tax system we have. The very richest people live off of investments, and those investments are taxed at a lower rate. So that's a different thing. So income is taxed here. That's what we're talking about. Then you have payroll taxes, and that is money just taken out of your paycheck that goes immediately to Medicare and Social Security and unemployment insurance. Those kinds of things are just taken out of your pay. The government just takes them. And then you have corporate income taxes, which is the income tax a corporation pays, right? And then you have something called an excise tax, which is just a tax on a specific good or service. So you might have like a tax on some kind of service. Probably the most familiar example to us now would be like food delivery. That'd be an extra tax on there for that. So those are the sources of revenues. This is government fees, but that's like when you go to get your driver's license or something like that, and that usually is just to offset the cost of whatever that service is. Here is the 2020 progressive income tax system, and I want to just sort of let's focus on the single filers column. You can see the marginal rate percentage there. It's 10%. Right? Or 12%, 22%, 24, 32, 35, 37. So you see the numbers do progress. They do get higher as the income gets higher. I think one of the things that you will notice in the coming slides is that 37% is relatively low compared to what it had been during the first part of the 1900s. And there's a lot to be said about that and a lot to think about in terms of America's standing in the world, America's standing in prosperity. The lower the tax rate has gone over the years for that top percent, marginal percent, the top two groups, the lower that tax rate has gone, you could argue has also coincided with a decline in America's greatness. And you can see it very starkly here, dating back to 1913. You can see how with the income tax coming in the 30s, late 30s, early 40s, that highest tax bracket was paying 90% or 90% rate. Pretty much through the 40s and 50s, that and even up into the early 60s, it was in the 90%. And John F. Kennedy lowered it to the 70s, where it sort of hung out for a couple of decades, a decade and a half maybe. And then Ronald Reagan came in and lowered it from the 70 to basically the 30s, high 30s, 40s. And so then it lowered even more in the 80s, and then Clinton took it back up to about where it is now, which is around 37%. But you see the deep cuts there, and that is a substantial amount of money when you're talking about losing that revenue, right? That is lost revenue for the U.S. government. Um, when you cut taxes over a certain amount of over that large amount, yes, politically it is very smart and it's going to get you reelected, but it has knock-on effects when we talk about deficits and we talk about not bringing in the revenue we need to bring in. It has knock-on effects. This is again the tax rate sort of based on where you fall in the income brackets, right? And so if you're in that top fifth, you're around 34%, and on down the line, you can sort of see this over again, the spread out over several decades. And again, this sort of shows us how the marginal rate of taxation has shifted over decades. So let's talk about the revenue, okay? And we're just, looking at the pie that is the American federal budget, and you can see that 47% of our revenue comes from individual income taxes. Well, that's very important. If 47% comes from individual income taxes, yet you saw these drastic cuts in the income rate over decades, then that part of the pie, which makes up the biggest part of your pie, is losing revenue streams. That is problematic. Payroll taxes is the next largest part of that pie. And again, why that can be problematic is the idea that if we have a large unemployed sector, that can be people not paying payroll taxes. So that's why it's always important to have people employed. Corporate taxes, you can see, are 12%. That's a relatively low percentage considering how much corporations have made in the last decade or two. And so obviously then these other taxes are not that substantial. But you can see the hit that we take with income taxes. This is the spending. So that first was revenue coming in. This is expenditures going out. You can see the two biggest expenditures are Social Security, unemployment, and Medicaid and Medicare healthcare. And that is there's a substantial chunk of our expenditures, followed by military, followed by interest on debt. So we spend more on the interest on our debt than we do on education, transportation, housing and community, and even international affairs, right? Those things combined are what we spend on interest on the debt, which is a problem because the interest on the debt doesn't get you anything, right? It's just as simple as a credit card. You get a credit card and you buy something for $100, but you're having to pay interest every month. That interest is nothing but just money for the credit card company. Well, interest on a debt is doing nothing but paying the interest down on our debt. We're not getting any housing for that. We're not getting quality schools for that. We're not getting quality roads and transportation for that. So it becomes problematic. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment, these are important programs that we have to keep. They're often called entitlement programs. Um, the question becomes, if these are programs we have to keep and they make up this much of our expenditures, we need to find more revenue to offset this. And so that's why I say, it's very important to understand the balancing of revenue and expenditures. And we're going to look at the debt clock at the end of this presentation, and you'll see it even more starkly. So a deficit and surplus, we'll talk a little bit about this. A deficit is when the expenditures you're spending exceeds the revenue. And we have been in deficit spending pretty much since the beginning of the 2000s. Bill Clinton, in the last several years of his administration, had us in a surplus where the revenue coming in exceeded the expenditures going out. That was so end of Clinton's term, 98, 99, 2000, we were in a surplus. But pretty much since then, we've been in deficit spending. And one of the largest reasons for that deficit spending was because of the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. And that led to a large, obviously, outlay of money and to deficit spending. Towards the end of Obama's second term, he was able to lower the deficit spending a little bit, but it has shot back up. Under Trump, mostly because of the tax cuts that he gave. And again, as I have said, if you cut taxes but keep spending the same amount, then you obviously are going to have deficits. So our national debt is actually it's $27 trillion now, which we'll talk about at the end. So this is a chart that says exactly what I've been saying throughout this whole presentation, that the spending is growing faster than the revenue. And this stops at 2009 because I want to kind of talk about the Great Recession on this slide a little bit. You can sort of see how spending and revenue for the better part of 40 years were relatively close to each other. And then you can see, I mentioned at the end of Clinton's tenure, revenue went above spending. So you can sort of see that there in this chart. And then after Clinton left office, we had 9/11, we had a couple of wars that we got involved in. Between those wars and then the Great Recession, you can see, and I just like this chart because it illustrates so clearly the separation between spending and revenue. You can see the lines pulling apart from each other, and continued to pull apart from each other for several years. And eventually, Obama began to bring some of them back a little bit closer together. Here is again that same map, but this goes out to 2020, and it's set up as more of a bar graph. But again, you can sort of see 2009, 2010, 2011, and even into 2012, was massive deficit spending because of the Great Recession. And then in 13, 14, 15, 16, Obama kind of gets it under control. But then with the tax cuts that Trump signed, you can sort of see the steps going back up. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And just like in the recession, even worse, with the pandemic, that was a spike in spending, a needed spike in spending. Right, people needed us to spend, and one of the theories of budgets that some economists have is that the best way to get out of a crisis like the pandemic or the Great Recession is to spend money, right? And there's some value in that. Like if you spend money to get out of it, so like you spend money on helping create jobs, and then those jobs create incomes for people, and those people can then pay income taxes. They can then pay payroll taxes, and so those kinds of things are often is an argument for deficit spending. So there are a couple of organizations within the government that deal with budgets. As the Office of Management and Budget, which is a office within the executive branch that helps draft the budget and reflects the priorities of the administration. Then they look at that to Congress. Congress then prepares its own budget with the Congressional Budget Office, and those two budgets get together and they figure out what they want to do and how they kind of make that work. The different committee members. Bernie Sanders in the Senate is the new budget chairman in the Senate, and he along with the OMB and the CBO will get together and craft a budget. Since Congress has got to sign off on any budget because they're in charge of the purse strings, they've got to sign off on the budget, but often they want to do that in conjunction with the president. So the president and Congress, through these two bodies, work together to craft a budget and put their priorities out there. So it is important to remember that obviously Congress has got different priorities than the president. They're dealing with different constituencies in many ways. Congress is dealing with their constituents back home. Remember, those people may be wherever state that is, and that's very different state to state. But the president is also dealing with a nationwide constituency, but he's also, or she is also dealing with a more global constituency as well. Like they're going to have to think about military spending. They're going to have to think about foreign aid. So there's always a kind of a tension between the two, and that's always sort of at play. There are certain things that are just mandatory that we have to spend money on. And then there are things that are uncontrollable, things that we don't, we can't foresee, discretionary things. So mandatory Social Security, Medicaid, military retirement, all these things are mandatory. In other words, if you're looking to cut something or save some money somewhere, you can't cut Social Security. That's not a program you can get rid of. If you want to save money somewhere, if you think we're spending too much money, you go to education, you go to energy and environment, you go to some of those little ones that I showed you in the chart earlier, the pie graph earlier. The problem with that is those aren't very big fish, right? Those aren't very big fish. You're not going to be able to save a lot of money out of those. But that's generally where, if you're going to make a cut, you make a cut. Discretionary spending is the things that I mentioned a few minutes ago, things where you can make cuts, you can change, you can raise or lower the spending on things like that. And so obviously the public health, social services, Social Security, military, those things are high priority and are pretty untouchable. But housing and urban development, you can tweak the budget for that. Now, some people may have issue with that, but that's a political issue. And that's an issue worth engaging in a conversation about. So why do we not have a balanced budget? Well, there's several reasons why we don't have a balanced budget. And it has to do with, as I have said at the beginning of this presentation, taxes. No one wants to raise taxes. It's political suicide to raise taxes, particularly after we've had decades of taxes decreasing. It would be political malfeasance for someone to say, "Oh, I'm not, we're not going to raise taxes." They wouldn't get elected. Cutting spending programs. What exactly are you going to cut? You're going to be known as the president cuts education spending. I mean, that's going to backfire. Reforming Social Security, how you do it, when you do it, you're always going to alienate old people, and old people vote. And that's a problem, right? That's a political problem. Medicaid, Medicare, it's the same thing. These are people who need health insurance. They have health insurance through these programs. They're very popular. You're going to cut people's health insurance there? No. You're not going to cut the military either. So all of those choices are difficult and all have political implications that if we're not aware of, then if you don't pay attention to, you go, well, we'll just raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans. Okay, well that's great if you're sitting in a civics class in Little Rock Central High School, but if you're a real elected policymaker and you talk about raising taxes on corporations and raising taxes on the wealthiest 1%, that's not going to go over very well. Just ask Elizabeth Warren, right? So it may sound good and it may be sound economic policy, but politically it may be a non-starter. And that's the choices that we face. And so balancing the budget, though it's like, well, I have to balance my budget every month at a personal level. Yeah, you do, but you also don't have the power to collect taxes. So the federal government is always sort of facing this push and pull of spending money and bringing money in, on which they have made much more difficult because of the political implications of that. So what happens when Congress and the president can't agree? And that was pretty much Obama's experience, and even some of George W. Bush's experience. They have to pass what's called a continuing resolution. And it just means that the budgets of all these agencies are functioning under the previous year's allocation. So that's a thing that happened for about a decade or so, where the Congress just couldn't agree on raising the budget in different areas. So they just continued to pass the budget, and it's kind of kicks the can down the road. And then there can be government shutdowns when non-essential personnel can be furloughed and told to stay home. There have been several shutdowns of the government in the last 15 years. And so agreeing on a budget is very important to keep the government from being shut down. It's very important to try to find ways to compromise and get the budget passed so that we don't have a shutdown, so we don't have government employees not working, so we have programs that are functioning and growing and contributing. And so those are all it's all very important. I'm bringing up the U.S. debt clock now, and I want to just quickly show you this. On the left here, the red numbers, you'll see the U.S. debt is now 28 trillion. It's gone up just since I did the slideshow because you can see how quickly it's going up. So that's our national debt. You can see, but what I want to focus on is the spending. Okay, so we spend about $6.6 trillion, but we're only bringing in $3.4 trillion. Well, that's deficit spending. You can see where that 3.4 trillion kind of gets made, right? You can see corporate taxes here at about 213 billion. You can see income tax revenue at about 1.6 trillion, payroll taxes at 1.3 trillion. So you add up all of this, the tariffs and over there, and you can get there. But the deal is, the more we cut taxes, the more we take income taxes off, lower income tax rates and things like that, which sound good to individuals and individuals alike. It has knock-on effects because we know that we're going to be spending roughly $6 to $7 trillion, right? So if we are serious about debt, if we are serious about not being in deficit spending, something's got to give. And I don't know that people are necessarily willing to cut $3 trillion worth of programs from our federal government. That seems like a bit much. But so then the only other real option to that is to raise taxes, which is politically not something that's going to happen. So that is the lecture on budgets. That will be an assignment in the folder for you to design, create what you think is a fair federal budget. So there's a couple of sentences, maybe a paragraph. It can even be bullet points. You're just going to put out there how would you create a fair federal budget? What would your tax rates be? Who would get taxed? How much would they get taxed? What would you spend money on? How would you allocate spending? So as you go through the assignment page, all of this will be there, and you'll just kind of create your own fair system, whatever fair means to you. And so that will be the assignment. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a good week. Talk to you later.